Hey, I'm Pastor Josiah Black, and welcome back to our study of Micah here at First Baptist Church in Peru, Indiana. Uh, I say this at different points, but we're about to start a new chapter. It'll be chapter 6. So I would just ask that if you haven't been sort of part of our study up to this point, I would suggest you go back and watch our other videos first, just so you can be caught up and know where we're at and where we find ourselves in the narrative of Micah. It's kind of important to be able to put those pieces together. But whether you're new or coming back, I'm glad you're here. And let's get into Micah chapter 6. We're looking at verses 1 through 5 today, and those go as follow. Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead my case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say. Hear, you mountains, the Lord's accusation. Listen, you everlasting foundations of earth. For the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak king of Moab plotted and what Balaam son of Beor answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. So, here we see a very specific format for this scripture, for this information. And this is what is known as a covenant lawsuit. So what exactly is going on here? Well, first of all, I just want to remind you again, I think we talked about this at an earlier point, but in the event we didn't, remember that a covenant at this time was generally understood in the culture to be a legally binding agreement between two people, two groups of people most commonly. The most common way that you would see these was between a more powerful nation or entity and a less powerful nation or entity. And there would be certain terms that were guaranteed back and forth. Usually, for the smaller entity, they would be receiving protection from other military forces or from other cultures. And the larger person in that equation would provide that. And then in exchange, the smaller person would agree to a certain amount of tribute. They'd maybe agree to join in if the bigger nation went to war, all kinds of things. The same kind of terms that we'd see in a treaty these days. So when God used that language of covenant with Israel, he was taking the position of the more powerful nation. He put it into terms that they would understand. This is what our relationship is going to be like. I'm going to provide these things. In the case of God, it was his presence, it was land, it was descendants that would number the stars. If we go back to Abraham, we can find kind of all the things. A temple, a king, over time. By the time we get to this, kings had been sort of added to it. That wasn't part of the initial thing. But anyway, the point is God has sort of promised these things to Israel. In response to that, Israel is supposed to follow through in the things God has asked of them. To live in a certain way, according to the law that was outlined at length, in parts of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Like it's in there, right? And Leviticus. What we find is that Israel has not been faithful. They have not held up their end of that covenant. Okay, so that's what brings us to chapter 6. And why God and Micah have chosen to present this as a covenant lawsuit. That's why we see almost right off the bat in verse 2, we see, for the Lord has a case against his people. He is lodging a charge against Israel. He isn't just being hyperbolic here. Like they have a covenant agreement. It's a very specific agreement with specific terms, and Israel has violated those. So God is choosing to introduce this, hey, this is why things are not about to go your way. And I'm introducing it in this sort of legal format and kind of making the case to you so you understand why I'm reacting the way I'm reacting. That's kind of God's motivation here. This language of stand up, plead my case before the mountains, let the hills hear what you have to say, hear you mountains. This idea of talking to the mountains and the earth is really just supposed to solidify God's power, God's preeminence, the fact that he is all powerful and is the one with the authority and the position to sort of bring this case, if you will. So that's the significance of that language. That is a little bit more, flowery and metaphoric. There aren't literal mountains that he had to go to plead this case or anything like that. But the point here is we've got a covenant lawsuit on our hands. So that means is in ensuing verses, we're going to see a few things. We're going to see, first of all, God making a case today. We're going to cover this. God making a case for how he has been faithful in his upholding of the covenant. And then we'll see him explain the shortcomings of Israel and really make a statement about where they've fallen short. And that'll be next week. And then the week after that, when we close out chapter 6, there's a big section where he talks about what's going to happen next. So that's kind of the framework we're working with here. So verses 3 through 5 then we can understand as God expressing and reminding them of how he's been faithful in these various circumstances and situations. So let's hear that again now. My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. Okay, so God's doing a lot of callbacks here. I'm assuming the folks that I know that watch this are pretty familiar with the biblical narrative, but I do want to touch on what each one of these is in the event you're watching this and you maybe don't know these stories. So first of all, God asked this question, my people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. And this is kind of rhetorical because it's really just the setup for God to tell them, remind them of these great things that he's done on their behalf. First of all, brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. That, of course, is the story of most of the first half of Exodus, really, of God reestablishing contact with the Hebrew people through Moses, who appealed to Pharaoh on their behalf, and ultimately, by the actions of God and Moses following God's commands, the people were led up and out of slavery. So there's a lot more to it than that, but God's reminding them that they are free because of his intervention and his action and the leaders that he had sent. Moses to lead them, also Aaron and Miriam, who both were leaders in their own ways in different perspectives and aspects of the life of the people of Israel. So Moses and Aaron, of course, get the most press, but Miriam's in there, and we see her taking a leadership role in a couple different places. Of course, most notably here, she's named alongside her Moses and Aaron. So it was that little cluster of people who did the work. So that's also, hey, this is God saying, look, here's also where I was faithful. I sent you these folks to lead you and lead you well, lead you ethically. So then he takes them to, my people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, plotted and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Okay? If you'll remember, Balak, who was king of Moab, as it says here, plotted a couple different things. First of all, he wanted to essentially muster forces to attack the Hebrews as they were kind of navigating. The idea was to kind of take them out before they got to where they were going. And so he kind of conspired with his allies, who were Midianites, to stop Israel from settling in the Promised Land. So that was kind of their move. And, of course, that was ultimately complicated when God spoke to Balaam through his donkey and told him, and an angel really did it, but at God's command, and told Balaam to go and complicate these efforts, okay, to not let that work out. Balak also later tried to, after that didn't work out, he tried to gather women together to sort of seduce the Israelite men away from their call, their cause, and the way God had asked them to live. So Balak's a troublemaker, but God's reminding the Israelites here that God worked through Balaam to stop him from doing these things. He got them through that. He delivered them essentially from the hands of their enemies and got them safely to the Promised Land. which actually is what the last example he gives is. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. So again, this is just one more place where God was with them. Shittim was the last stop before the Israelites reached Canaan. It was probably in what we now know as Jordan, sort of in that region. They crossed over, and Gilgal was their first place, their first stop in the promised land in Canaan. So God's making a point here to say, I got you from there to here, to the place that you were meant to be, and I ensured that that journey would be safe. So of all the things that came up on that last little move, I made it right. I made it safe. I got you where you were going. And it's probably the way that it's said here from Shittim to Gilgal, it is both that segment of the journey, but in all likelihood, it's also meant to evoke the whole journey too. I got you from point A to point B. Don't forget that. So there's a lot here, and I know that, and that's true, I think, anywhere in the Bible. Rarely are things so straightforward that we don't need to do any work to understand exactly what's being experienced or said. But interesting here that this is, again, that lawsuit language, which means everything else we're going to hear in chapter 6 falls under that heading. In one way or another, it's connected to that idea. So it bears saying, and it'll probably bear repeating, so that we can understand what exactly God is doing, what he's trying to argue, and what he's trying to bring an awareness of to the Israelites, so that they can get why, oh, right, this isn't going the way it should. So, yeah, that's what it comes down to. Again, today was really about God saying, I've got a case. Israel isn't being covenant faithful. And first off, here, let me show you the ways I've been faithful and I've held up my end. Okay, so that's what we should have gotten out of today. Thanks for joining. Sorry if this was a little rambly. It's one of those things where I'm trying to distill for you a lot of concepts from that culture that we understand some of, but we don't fully understand. Because what we have from this time is really we've got the Bible, which is historical to an extent, but also in some places intended to be allegorical, and in other places intended to be poetic. And so sometimes it can get a little complicated to tease out what exactly is being said and why at any given point. So this is one of those sections where you kind of got to know that. But beyond that, there isn't a lot that we have in terms of written records and full understandings about how all these cultures and ideas functioned. And it's stuff that scholars have pieced together over time, but it's not like studying, say a group of people 50 or 60 years ago where we had modern documentation and it just takes time to pour through things. This is literally thousands and thousands of years ago that some of this was being written. So it just requires us to do a little extra legwork. So if it did seem rambly, that's the only reason. And I hope that you've stuck with it and that you understand what we're talking about here. If you've got questions, as always, you're welcome to contact me. If there's something you don't understand or that I didn't address or that maybe you need to hear differently, let me know. And I'll have at least one discussion question in the Facebook post. So if you watch this video, I'd love it if you'd engage with that. And we're going to continue to go through Micah. So we've got a little bit left to go, and hopefully this has been edifying. So we'll see you along the way. Bye.